time on the fantastic topic of how the people of Israel turned from a family into a nation, and we're really talking about the the border between Sefer Bereshit and Sefer Shemot. And today is going to be like an introduction class to the big topic. Obviously, the most of our time is going to be learning specific stories in the book of Exodus, and trying to ask the big question we're going to ask is, what does it take to turn from a family with a specific own history and relationship of the family into a people, and what does that mean to be the people of God, and what is the difference between being the people of God before Matan Torah, before giving the Torah, and after giving the Torah, and really where does this story ends in the book of Exodus. So we have a real journey, and we have big questions to look into. And what I want to do today, as I said, I'd like to do an introduction, and we can't go into the book of Exodus without seeing, the preparation for it in the end of Genesis. And for that, I asked you to bring the Chumash, but I also going to to share it here with you. And no, not this. And we're going to look, oops, is that? Okay. And we're going to look into the last chapter of the book of Genesis, which we actually just read this past Shabbos in Parashat Vayechi. And it's a very, very moving chapter, where we have at the beginning of the chapter, we have the meeting of Yosef and Yaakov. And of course, that's a very moving scene where Yosef sees his father after 20 years, and he 17 years, and he hugs him, vayevkala vayishaklo. And sorry, I was completely, my mind is were elsewhere. This is the scene after Yaakov passes away, after he dies, and Yosef, falls on his father's face, and he cries, and he kisses him, and that's the goodbye. And then Yosef commanded his servants and the physicians to embalm his father, and the physician embalmed Israel, which is again a very interesting scene. Yeah, Yosef, having lived in Egypt for so many years, becoming the second to the Egyptian king, wanting to keep his father as whole as possible, as he knew the Egyptians can do to the great people, to important people, and he wants his father to be embalmed also. And after 40 days, in verse 3, וימלאו לו 40 yom, they waited 40 days, and all of Egypt wept, for 70 days. And it's a very interesting to hear Egyptian rituals. After a very important person dies, they cry for 70 days. And here, the only relationship they had to Yaakov was the fact that he was the father of their king, or the second, of Yosef. And I think what the Torah is trying to tell us is and it has two sides to it. One side is as a negative side, how deep and rooted Yosef was in Egypt, and now so does his brothers. But in the other in the other hand, how in the other aspect is how much respect the Egyptians had for Yosef and his family and his father. And that respect is important because, as we remember, when we go to enter the book of Genesis, we're going to meet a king, a pharaoh that doesn't know Yosef, that doesn't remember Joseph, which is a hard thing to do because Yosef is there, in the memory of the Egyptians, of helping them and saving them, etc., etc. But at the last chapter of Genesis is the separation, the goodbye, of Yosef from his father, from Yaakov after Yaakov dies, and the mourning days, and then Vayavru in verse number 4, Vayavru yemei b'chiyato, after everyone finished crying, Yosef ordered the house of Paro, and he wants to ask one more thing. And I know Purim is ahead, and we still have time because also we have a double Adar this year. But I'd like you to hear that there's a relationship between the story of Yosef and the story of Esther and Mordechai. Two stories about Jews who got to a higher position in a foreign country. And listen to the words, וידבר יוסף אל בית פרעה לאמור, אם נא מצאתי חן בעיניכם, דברו נא באוזני פרעה לאמור. If now I have found favor in your eyes, are the exact same words that Esther is going to ask the king for one more favor, or for a favor that she would like him, she would want to ask him for. And what is the favor that Yosef asks from Paro? And he says, verse number 5, Avi hishbi'ani lemor, hine anochi met bekivri asher kariti li be'eretz Knan. My father made me swear, saying that I should bury him in the land of Canaan, in the grave which he digged for himself. That's where my father asked me to bury him. And please give me permission. Now therefore let me go, and I pray thee, and bury my father, and I will come back. Now this verse is a very important verse, because in one hand, Yosef is definitely loyal to his father. He would like to do what Yaakov asked him to do. But in the other hand, he knows he cannot stay in Canaan. In other words, the death of Yaakov, who might have been a good excuse for Yosef and his brothers to pack up their things and move back to Canaan, Yosef knows that it's not possible. So he just asked for this temporary, pass to go to Canaan, bury his father, and he promises Paro, I will return. I will come back. I will come back. It's also because I have duties, and I owe you, Paro, and Yosef here, that's the real sense that we have from him, that he is in a position that many people are under his responsibility, and he doesn't let that away. He feels that. That's why he also wants to come back. And Paro gives him the permission, and Pharaoh said, go up, bury your father, as he has made thee swear. And Yosef goes up, ויעל יוסף לקבור את אביו, verse 7, ויעלו איתו כל עבדי פרעה זקני ביתו וכל זקני ארץ מצרים. And with him went up all the servants of Paro and the elders of his house and all the elders of the land of Egypt. And we ask ourselves, what is that? This is like a funeral you give to a president. Why all these people are going with Yosef to Canaan to bury his father. And again here, the text is playing on two very, very delicate ways of understanding. One, they give respect and they share Yosef's grief. And because Yosef is such an important persona in Egypt, they go with him. But maybe also we can say that Pharaoh has a little fear that maybe Yosef will stay in Canaan after all. So he wants to make sure that there are enough people there with Yosef in Egypt that that he won't have any option to stay in the land of Canaan. And what we have here at the last chapter of Sefer Bereshit, before we're going to move to Sefer Shemot, to Genesis in Egypt, we are at the border between Canaan and Egypt all the time. Yosef went down to Egypt, the brothers went down to Egypt, the brothers went back to Canaan and told Yaakov all the story, and then they went back to Egypt, and then Yosef said, I am your brother, and then went back to Canaan, and they got Yaakov. There's always a switch, and people are moving back and forth from Canaan to Eretz Mitzrayim, to Egypt. And at the last chapter, I think there's someone with an open microphone. If you can please turn off your mic.
Take it for a year, and then you're not obligated for a second year. You can always renew it.
I hear. Do you hear that echo as well, or it's just me?
No, Mrs. Sarah Eiferman have the microphone.
Okay, so if you can please turn off the mic, that'll be great. Thank you. Okay, so we move back and forth between Canaan and Egypt, and this is the last scene in Sefer Bereshit. In other words, in the end of Sefer Bereshit, Egypt is already there. The scene of Egypt is already there. But as a family, they go as a family and as individuals back to Eretz Mitzrayim. And I go back to verse number 8. So all the people, all the elderly of Egypt went up with Yosef. And of course, all of the household of Yosef, ve'echav uvet aviv, and all the household of Joseph and his brethren and his father's house, only their little ones and their flocks and their herds, they left in the land of Goshen. Okay, in other words, all the oldest people, the elderly, the grown-up went up to Canaan, and the young children and all of their belongings and flocks, etc., they left in Goshen, the territory which they got from Paro, where they dwelt. So we have to really imagine a parade. I don't know if parade is the right word to use for a funeral, but this is a lot of people. It's a voyage from Mitzrayim to Canaan, all the elderly of Egypt, all the people of Israel, and the household, and the brothers, and their oldest children, and the slaves that help carrying all the things. And also in verse 9 we hear, and there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. It made a lot of impression. Everyone could see that Yosef is heading that voyage, is heading that company towards the land of Canaan to bury his father as he swore to his father. And all these people are coming with him as of respect to Yaakov, as of respect to Yosef, as of making sure that Yosef and his brothers are going to come back. But for sure they're going to come back because they left their little kids back home. So the worry wasn't so much there, but the Torah really make sure that we will understand that Yaakov got a funeral as he deserved. What do we mean as he deserved? As the last patriarch, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who lived in the land of Canaan. Maybe because the Torah knows that the story is going to be so different afterwards, and they give him a lot of respect, and they in verse number 10. I'm not going to read everything. He made mourning for his father, and for 7 days they mourn, right? They kind of made a shiva for seven days. And the people of Canaan, and when the inhabitants of the land of Canaan saw the mourning, and they said, wow, this is a great grief, not to the Hebrews, not to the children of Yaakov, the son of Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, these Hebrew people who came from, Mesopotamia, who came from Ur Kasdim and Haran. This is a great grief to Egypt. And that gave the inhabitants of the land of Canaan huge respect to this Hebrew family. Of course, I'm not using the word Jewish because they were not called Jews yet. There were the children of Israel, the children of Jacob, Abanim Shel Yaakov. And everyone is astonished about the respect that the Egyptians are giving this Hebrew person, Jacob, and they get a lot of respect. Now, there's nothing to do with the respect of the people of Canaan because they're going back to Egypt. Had they stayed in Canaan, maybe the relationship between the children of Yaakov and the people of Canaan would have been different. Maybe they could cooperate economically and agriculturally, etc., etc. And they wouldn't bother them, they wouldn't hurt them because they know they under the protection of the Egyptians. But we couldn't enjoy that because the people of Israel, the children of Yaakov, went back to Mitzrayim. But I do want to mention one thing, because this is an important detail to say when we enter as a family to the land of Israel, and when we move from the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus. Egypt was the greatest empire, the strongest empire, the most stable empire of the ancient world. For thousands of years, it was the only strong country who wasn't taken by the Assyrian, by the Babylonians, by the Persians. It was only at the time of the Greeks, that there's a little bit of a shaken, situation was there. And then, of course, the Romans, and we know the story of Cleopatra and Antonio and Antony, etc., etc. But for thousands of years, the Egyptian civilization was on its might and strength for almost 4,000 years in a row. There's no other precedent for that in the ancient world. Nobody messed with Egypt. And that's why all the people around wanted to have peace treaties with Egypt, including later on in Jewish history by the Jewish kings. Shlomo, we know, married one of the daughters of Pharaoh at his time. Of course, we're talking about 100 years later, almost 500 years later. But here, for this little family who came 3 generations ago from Ur Kasdim to dwell in Canaan, and they were really weird because they did strange things that nobody else did around them. And for all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan to watch the respect that the Egyptians give the father of the family was a great thing, was something to be remembered. But as I said before, this family, Yaakov's children, couldn't enjoy that because they had to go back to Egypt. But in the background, the memory of Canaan was Egypt gave a lot of respect to Yaakov, and they carry him. Verse 13, they carry him and they bury him in Me'arat HaMachpelah. For his sons carried him into the land of Canaan and buried him into the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham bought with the field for the possession of the burying place of Ephron the Hittite in front of Mamre. And that's another important verse that we have here at the last chapter of Sefer Bereshit. Ma'arat Machpelah, the cave of the field of Machpelah, was legitimately bought by Abraham, the grandfather of Yaakov. He bought it from Ephron, and there were witnesses there that he bought it from him, and that's where Yaakov wanted to be buried. And Yosef gave him that, and Paro agrees to give him that, and they bury him there, and immediately after, in verse 13, and they return to Egypt. Vayashav Yosef Mitzrayma hu ve'echav. And why do you have to tell me Yosef went back to Egypt, him and his brother and his brothers? You know, the verse could have told me, and they all went back to Egypt. The Torah wants us to know, and to make sure that we understand that every last person of that huge voyage who left Egypt to accompany Yaakov in his last, in his burial, they all went back to Egypt. Nobody stayed. The land of Canaan is empty of descendants of the children of Yaakov. Vayashav Yosef, and Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brethren, and all that went up with him to bury his father after he had buried his father. And there's another aspect here. It sounds like the burial was a private thing between Yosef and Yaakov. He was the father of all the rest of the brothers, but it's Yosef who is busy with burying his father. The verse states that it's Yosef who buried his brothers, who buried his father, and now there's a tension starting, and the tension is maybe even stronger when we read that he had buried his father. What's with the rest of the brothers? Weren't they there as well? Yes, they were there. But there was something going on in a very private and intimate place between Yosef and Yaakov, and between the obligation that Yosef felt that he owes his father, after the entire story. And in a way, out of nowhere, we get to verse 15. And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, let's stop here. What do you mean, and when they saw their father was dead? Their father was already dead for tens of days, right? They had him for 40 days in the embalmment, and then they moved. Then they had to walk. It takes from Egypt to Hebron. I don't know, maybe 3 days. What do you mean they where is it? And they saw that their father was dead. The pasuk, the verse wants to tell us, of course, not that they saw that now they realize their father is dead, but now that their father was dead, there was something that was bothering them. That as long as he was alive, they didn't bring it up because they felt they were protected. Now that Yaakov was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and will fully requite us all the evil which we did unto him. This is really unbelievable and out of nowhere, because we felt that everything was settled down. A conciliation and asking forgiveness, and he told them it's not you, it's God. And they cry, he cries, they bring Yaakov down to Mitzrayim to live with him. What do you mean? Where did you bring it? In other words, they worry that now that he was nice to them as long as Yaakov was alive. Now that Yaakov is dead, maybe all the hatred, and maybe he will feel that this is time to revenge. And maybe it's the first time that they say out loud that what they did to him was evil. והשב ישיב לנו את כל הרעה אשר גמלנו אותו. We did evil unto him. We were not good. This is very, very strong, and we need to hear that. Yaakov is dead. What does that mean that Yaakov is dead? That means that the elder generation, the last one of the elder generation, is not there at the scene. And it's the first time that we find the family with no patriarch, with no leadership. There are 12 brothers, and Yosef is the leader in Mitzrayim, but amongst the brothers, there's Reuven, who is the firstborn, and there's Yehuda, who took responsibility. But the brothers now are afraid that the construction of the family is very fragile, and they rightfully are worried that Yosef, deep inside, never forgave them, and he will hate them, and he will want revenge for all the evil that they did unto him. So the good thing is that they confess that what they did was bad, what they did was ra'ah, was evil, and he didn't deserve it. But the sad thing is that in the big drama of, I would say, not just the family, but the big drama of humanity, and this is what we saw from the beginning of the book of Bereshit with Cain and Abel. In the big drama of humanity, it is so hard to gain trust between brothers. When I say brothers, I mean, different nations, different groups, even though here it's really the same family. And the Torah teaches us that in order to be in good relationship amongst human beings, amongst a group of people, whether they're family or a community or a nation, when there's a doubt in the well-being, when there is a doubt in the goodness of the other person or in other parts of the group, there will never be peace. And I find it incredibly brave and incredibly as a gift that the Torah is giving us by saying that sentence, because the Torah tells us, I know that it's very hard to trust each other. But if you're not going to work on trust, if you're not going to accept that people forgave you, humanity won't be able to continue. And the mere human act of saying, I forgive you, I genuinely forgive you, you accepting and you believing me, it's at the core of the ability to build a healthy and positive community. So now that doubt that was in their hearts all the time, but they knew that as long as Yaakov is alive, nothing is going to happen. Now that he's dead, they bring it up, which is, and they talk about it, okay? And they talk to each other, and they say, we don't know if we can trust him not to revenge, not to hurt us, even though he said he forgave us. And they turn to Yosef, ויצוו אל יוסף לאמור, אביך ציווה לפני מותו לאמור. And they turn to Yosef and they say, the father did command before he died, saying. Now, we don't know of anywhere before that in the book of Genesis that Yaakov ordered his children to saying those words. And it's a big question amongst the commentators, and I'm not going to go into it whether they changed the truth. In other words, Yaakov never told them that, but that was their way to make sure that Yosef will never hurt them, or that Yaakov did tell them that, and they never used it, and now they felt that it's the right time to use it. This is going to stay enigmatic. We're never going to know what really happened. And I think that the Torah purposely leaves it that way, because and again, it has to do, I think it has to do with what I said before about constructing relationship of trust and belief. If there is a doubt about the good intentions of the other part, then one part is going to live in fear. And when we live in fear, sometimes we are willing to do a lot of things in order to make sure that we are safe, including to change from the truth. And when they turn to Yosef, they say, so why did your father command us to tell you after he died? So shall you say to Joseph, this is what you should tell Yosef. Forgive, I pray thee now, the transgression of the brethren and their sin, for that they did unto thee evil. And now we pray thee, forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of the Father. And Joseph wept when they spoke upon him. Oh, it's it really is so tragic, because he really did forgive them already before, way before. And they lived happily after Yaakov was already down in Egypt. And now after he dies, he can hear in their words how frightened they are from him and how they can't really believe that he forgave them. And they put words in the mouth of Yaakov, the words that they really want to tell Yosef. Please forgive us. Please forgive us our sin. The transgression we did towards you was awful. Please forgive us, in the name of God. And he cries. He cries because it's hurtful to hear that people you forgave and maybe even learn how to love again still don't believe you forgive them. And the whole concept of forgiving, the whole concept of letting go of barriers from the past is so essential for creating a healthy relationship. Doesn't matter whether in partnership, in with our spouse, with our children, with our families, with our communities, with our nations, in the world. There's a famous, once I heard Rabbi Sachs, may his memory be blessed, and it was a moving talk. He spoke he gave the speech of Yamim Noraim in Elul, before Rosh Hashanah, and the title of his speech was, "We are an unforgiving era." And Rabbi Sachs said that people today do not know how to forgive. And every little mistake, or even when people are doing something in purpose, but they regret it, we don't hear the regret. We just keep pointing at them and saying, guilty, guilty, guilty. If we don't learn how to forgive, if we don't teach ourselves to trust, we won't be able to establish anything. You know, not a family, nevertheless, a nation. So in the transition between being a family and living and being created into a nation, this thing has to be worked out. And the tears, Yosef cries a lot, by the way. I love it. You know, he's a real person. It hurts him. He cries. There's no shame in crying. And when he hears that they still suspect he didn't forgive him, that he didn't forgive them, he cries. Vayefk Yosef, and Yosef wept when they spoke unto him. And vayelchu gam echav vayiplu lefanav vayomru hinenu lecha avadim. Now they still don't get it. And when they see that he cries, they come close to him and they fall on their face and they say, we will be your slaves. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face. And they said, behold, we are the bondmen. No, this is not what he wants. This is not what he wants. He wants you to live as a family. He wants to have his brothers back. But they're not there. There's a constant suspicion in the area. And when they see that he cries, they don't even know how to understand that cry. And they keep saying, we will be yours. He doesn't want them to be his slaves. He wants them to be his brothers. And then he gives that famous speech saying, and Yosef said to them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? ויאמר אליהם יוסף, אל תיראו כי התחת אלוהים אני. You must be God's slaves, not my slaves. And I am not under God to decide who is to get punished. I am not under God. I am a very powerful person. You know, he does have a lot of power in Egypt. But when he speaks to his brothers, when he cries hearing them, he says, he understands they're afraid, and he says, please don't be afraid. I'm not God. I cannot sentence you. It's in the hands of God. And as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring to pass as it is today, to save much people alive. Now it takes a lot of guts to say such a sentence after all the suffering he went through, after being separated from his family for 20 years. This is it's a very, very, very hard sentence. And we have to separate his sentence. He doesn't for 1 minute tell them, it's okay, what you did was okay. No, what you did was bad. Atem chashavtem alai ra. You meant evil against me. But in this world, there are two layers of being, of existence. There's the decisions we make as individuals. There's the decisions we make as part of being created in the image of God, having freedom of choice, and we can choose good and we could choose evil. They choose evil. But in the higher realm of existence, there are the plans of God, which we never understand. Sometimes we can see why, we can understand, as this story, where Joseph looks back and he says, now I understand why I had to get to Egypt, because I could save many people from the famine. But maybe that was not the only way to get to Egypt. By an act of malevolence by brothers to their own brother. You meant evil against me, But God's plan was different. God's plan was good. God's plan, you know, the way that he plans the world, this is where we don't get to understand every move. And I think that, again, at the end of the book of Genesis, where we met so many people and so much evil and so much rivalry and complicated relationship and things that happen that we don't understand. And that's on the level of the individual and a family. And we move into the book of Genesis with that, remembering that the bottom line, and we don't have Torah yet. There's no Mount Sinai yet. There is God speaking to people, and from the power of the idea that human being that human being were created in the image of God, that gives us the power to choose right or to choose bad. And that's the story. And it's true as individuals, and it's true as a nation. And I go back to Yosef now, and he says, so don't worry, don't be afraid. Now, therefore, fear ye not. I will sustain you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly unto them. And maybe that's the new thing. In other words, maybe up till now, even though he forgave them, maybe he spoke roughly to them. I don't know. But Yosef, as the brilliant person he was, he sees the fear in his brother's eyes, and he knows that it's not only what he's going to tell them, but it's how he's going to tell them. And he speaks softly to them, and he comforted them till they relaxed, and maybe till he feels that they gain trust in him. And then Vayosh and Yosef dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Yosef lived 110 years. That's another interesting thing that we know from archaeology and the history of Egypt, that in ancient Egypt, the respectful age to die was 110. 110 symbolized the full life to live. It has to do with their own way of counting things. We're not going to get into that, but the Torah aligns with that, right? Yosef died in the age of 110. Now we are, as readers, we know that maybe in the eyes of the Egyptians he lived full life, but in the eyes of the Torah he was almost there, right? He was almost there at 120, which is the round full years. And why? Well, because he had a difficult life, and it gave the impression. And the next verse is also, and again, and we move now into conclusions and into closure with the entire story of the Yosef story in the book of Genesis. So he dwelled in Mitzrayim with his household, and he lived for 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children and the third generations. In other words, he saw his great children, and he also saw וגם בני מחיר בן מנשה יולדו על ברכי יוסף. In other words, he saw children's both from Ephraim and from Menashe, his two children, and they were born upon Joseph's knees. Now, the phrase Birkei Yosef, or to be born on someone's knees, is the way in the ancient world. We know that phrase from other scriptures and writings of the ancient world in that time. That means that the father or the grandfather kind of adopt the child. In other words, they live close to him, and it's as if they were also his children. In other words, he's very close to his family, and he see continuance, which is another hopeful thing. All all the evil that happened, all the stress that happened, all the heartaches that happened. It's a good ending in an individual level, in the family level. He got to reconcile with his father. He had to live with his father for 17 years. And the commentators said, he lived with his father for 17 years till the time they sold him. And he got, for those 70 years he lived with him in Canaan, Yaakov got another 17 years living with Yosef in Egypt. So he lived with his father, and his father also saw his children. But Yosef also see his grandchildren. In other words, there's a horizon, there's hope, there's a future. And that's another aspect that takes us from the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus. We are here about the future. We are looking into the future. It's true, we live in the present. And the decisions we have to make are decisions in the present. But the ramification of our decisions will take us to the future. And we always have to have one eye in the present and one eye into the future. How would we like our future to look like? Because the way we want our future to look like has to do with how we live our lives today. And when Yosef sees his grandchildren, that sign of hope, there's a continuance to that family. This family that almost was broken and diminished, there's hope and there's a continuance. And then in verse 24, and Yosef said unto his brethren, I die, but God will surely remember you and bring you up out of this land unto the land which he swore to Abraham, to Yitzchak, to Yaakov. I have to read it in Hebrew. ויאמר יוסף אל אחיו, אנוכי מת, ואלוהים פקוד יפקוד אתכם, והעלה אתכם מן הארץ הזאת, אל הארץ אשר נשבע לאברהם, ליצחק וליעקב. We're talking about the future. We have grandchildren. You should never forget that this is a foreign land to you. This is just a detour in the story. And the real story has to continue in the land of our forefathers. And you shouldn't worry. I die, but God will remember you, and he will bring you up from this land to the promised land, the land of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now, I colored pakod ifkod, and I invite you to look at those words, because these are going to be code words that bring us from Sefer Bereshit to Sefer Shemot. Yosef is telling his brothers, God will remember you, and he says it twice. Pakod, yifkod. He could have said only one word, but he uses that verb twice. Remember, he will remember. And pakod ifkod in Hebrew has many, many understandings. He will count you, he will remember you, he will carry you. In other words, I'm going to be gone, and you have to take responsibility of what is happening in the land of Egypt. But the one thing you have to do is remember that God will remember you, and remember to remind everyone else that this is not for good, this is temporary. And then what Yosef is doing in verse 25, and Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely remember you, and you shall carry up my bones from hence. Yosef doesn't dare, and it's a good question, like why didn't he ask, like the way he asked Pharaoh to take his father to be buried in Canaan? Yosef knows that it's impossible. This is It's a new situation. And he's not, to take him after he dies, to take his body to the land of Canaan, after the, in the responsibility of the brothers, that can shake the relationship with the Egyptians and maybe amongst the brothers. And he accepts the fact that he's going to be burned temporarily in Egypt. But he says, I swear you. And he talks to his brothers, and he calls it, and the Torah calls them the children of Israel. Pakod yifkod Elohim etchem, twice. He says here in verse 24, Pakod yifkod, and he says in verse 25, Pakod yifkod, God will remember you, but you should remember me and carry up my bones from here back to Canaan. And what he does with such a sentence is few things I want to suggest. One, he says, I have all the faith in the world and trust God that he promised us we're going to get up, going to leave this land. He will do that. He's not going to let us stay in this land. The other thing that he tells them, I trust you so much that I trust you not to forget me. I trust you not to forget me and leave me behind. Now Yosef doesn't know for how long the children of Israel and his family is going to stay in Egypt. Is it going to be 1 generation, 2 generations? Did he think it's going to take 200 years? But what he gives them, I think, if I may, I believe that what Yosef is starting to do here is that notion of that is going to be carried on during the entire Jewish history of passing on from generation to generation code words and the identity and the promise. By remembering, we are who we are because we remember. When we stop to remember, and it doesn't matter what now, okay, I'm just about the act of memory. If we stop remembering and passing on from generation to generation the memory, the codes of identity, we will cease to be. And at the last days of his life, what Yosef is doing is saying, you have to trust God to keep his word. And I trust you not to forgive me, not to forget me behind. God is not going to forget. You please don't forget as well me back in Egypt. Take me up, and so I can continue to be part of your story, of the Israelite story. And the pakod pakan that we have at the last verses in Sefer Bereshit, we're going to find them. We're going to meet them again in the book of Genesis. And the last verse of Sefer of the last chapter of Sefer Bereshit, וימות יוסף בן 110 שנים ויחנתו אותו וישם בארון במצרים. So Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And here is also a mystery, okay? They embalmed him. Where was he buried? It's very clear where Yosef was, where Yaakov was buried, where Avram was buried, where Yitzchak was buried, where the mothers were buried. But with Yosef, we don't know. He is somewhere in a coffin in Egypt. Now, it's not for no reason that the last word of Sefer Bereshit is Mitzrayim, because that word takes us to the continuing of the story, to the next chapter, to the next Chumash, to the next book of Sefer Shemot. And the beginning and the end are always very, very important, And here I want to bring a Torah of Rav Sachs, of Rabbi Yonasan Sachs, and we'll end with that. What do we get? What do we understand? What's the connection between the beginning of the book of Genesis, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, and the last word of the book of Genesis, Mitzrayim? And Rabbi Sachs is saying that was the whole thing, the whole story of creation. And the stories in Sefer Bereshit are there to tell us that there's a different story, a different human story than the story that was told up till that time by the greatest civilization of the world, Egypt. The story that Egypt told was the kings are half gods. The common person belongs to the king. The life of the individual worth nothing. That's why we can build pyramids. Have you ever thought about that? You know, we are today trying to understand architecturally, how did they build the pyramids and how could they aim and how did they put the stones so straight to make the point? That is interesting. But what we should see in the pyramids is the tens and thousands of hundreds and thousands of people who died to build that. Why could they build it? Because if 10,000 people died a day climbing up with the stones, they would bring another shift of slaves, and they died building the pyramids. And the point was saying, oh, we're reaching up to heaven. It's the same thing as Migdal Bavel. And Rav Sachs is saying the Torah is telling us a different story, a story where every human being counts and every life is worth something. And there's only one God, and he's a God. He's not a human being king. And the relationship between human being and God is not ones of fear, but it's ones of trust. We start with Bereshit, bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. We start with the idea that that man was created in the image of God, and we end with Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim, if we put the vowels differently in Hebrew, we get the word Metzarim, a very tight place. Bereshit is wide. Being created in the image of God is expanding our abilities, our choices, our responsibilities. Being in Mitzrayim is narrowing it. And we go from the expand to a very narrow place, and we're moving into this narrow place from Sefer Bereshit to Sefer Shemot, and there we'll find our next challenge of how do we keep that notion of what our forefathers and our foremothers gave us, and the idea that every human was created in the image of God. How do we do that as being slaves in Egypt? We'll see that next week. תודה רבה.
תודה רבה. Good to see you, Rabbanit, again.
You too. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And I really do want to say that if you have questions, you please just open your unmute yourself and ask the question. It's really, I'll be happy to hear what you have to say and join the class. It shouldn't be a lecture. Yeah, we can talk. בסדר, תודה רבה, שבוע טוב.
תודה רבה, שבוע טוב.
להתראות.